It's such a pleasure, honestly, and it was really a pleasure when you first asked me to present this lecture. I mean, so talk about esteemed company, the Haberdashers' Company. That in itself was a thrill. And I'm particularly looking forward to my discussion with the Haberdashers' students who are sitting here in the front and shortly will join me on the stage. And I'm also looking forward to the interaction with all of you in the audience. But it's also a very personal pleasure for me as well, because one of my closest colleagues and friends, Dr. Angela Stent, who's Emeritus Professor at Georgetown University and also a Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution, was actually a student at Haberdasher Ask School for Girls in Acton. I don't think she wants me to say the dates, but I have them here anyway, 1952 to 1965. And she went, let's say that to Angela if you see her. And she was at Haberdashers before going to study at Cambridge and then at Harvard universities. Angela's parents had left Germany in the late 1930s and had to start their lives again from scratch here in England. And it was Haberdashers that offered Angela a path forward. And her record of stellar accomplishment, which includes government service as well in the US State Department and National Intelligence Council, I followed her in several of these positions, in addition to her great generosity of spirit and her personal integrity, I think is a testament to the centuries-long tradition of educational support by Haberdashers Livery Company. And I'm really honoured to know her, and I'm really honoured to be with you as a result of knowing someone who was just such a wonderful graduate of your institutions. Well, we had quite the grand title for this lecture tonight, and I think it's quite trite, but I'm going to say it anyway, that we're meeting at a particularly challenging time. The world's increasingly complex. In fact, it's probably got more complex in the last 5 or 10 minutes because I haven't got constantly glued to my phone. And if something's happened, I'm sorry, I might not know about it. But it's very unpredictable as well. We've got the global political and security orders in flux. All the balances of power are shifting. And even the fundamentals of our national power have been shaken by all the dramatic economic, technological, demographic and climate changes that we've experienced over the last several decades. And we find ourselves in a period that's defined by a competition over who shapes both regional and global orders. And this is a competition that's not just conducted among and between states. Lily, one of the students here, is studying history. And I think we're at a remarkable period in history. I was interested in studying history at college because it's not just states that are engaged in competition, but it's terrorist groups, it's private actors, including, of course, technology titans that we keep hearing about all the time. There are so many different actors invested in the geopolitical game, not entirely unprecedented, but certainly a very unusual moment to be in. So here we have so many different actors vying to shape the world to further their own interests, frankly at the expense of everyone else. And conflicts around the world, from Europe to the Middle East and Africa, are also in a very troubling phase. They're marking the reduction in concern for and attention to minimizing civilian casualties. That was, of course, an embedded feature of the international system set up after the horrors of World War II, reducing civilian casualties, putting civilians off the battlefield. And of course, we're here at the beginning of May and rapidly approaching next week the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. On May 8th, we'll have VE Day. And if we think back to that commitment that we made to ourselves to ensure that we would never again engage in the brutal mass slaughter of fellow human beings, well, here we are, we're doing it again. And moreover, even societies that are not technically at war are constantly under siege and attack. We're personally and collectively subjected every single day to the pernicious influence and effects of psychological and so-called hybrid warfare. We're bombarded by the deliberate destructive power of weaponized disinformation and broadly propagated conspiracy theories. And we also find ourselves in a period where it's not just foreign adversaries who are interested in promoting and expanding societal discord, but also domestic actors who have the same interests. They all hope to exploit this period of time. And the relentless propaganda assault that we've had over the last decade has very sadly fed the loss of popular trust and confidence in our institutions and system of government, especially at a time when we need them more than anything else, facing real existential threats to humanity from climate change, ecosystem collapse, and pandemics. So this is a grim background, I'm afraid. Hopefully we'll be a bit more hopeful as we get to the questions with our representatives from the Haberdashers' schools. But against this background, we, of course, had the election last year in the United States. And as that's the place that I spend most of my time, I'd just like to reflect upon that for the moment as well, because that election has brought a whole set of new challenges, including the dramatic set of ruptures with America's past policy and practice at home and abroad. And together, these developments highlight the failure of the mechanisms to keep the peace and deter war that we had put in place again 80 years ago. We see the breakdown of the post-Cold War global order, and also, most significantly, the end of Pax Americana, the end of the US-dominated and led international system that began in 1945. So this gets to the theme of resilience, because we're going to need a lot of individual fortitude and societal resilience to navigate our way through what comes next. It's not going to be easy, unfortunately. Now, just to expand a little bit, and this is something that actually links into my book, which William has left here as well, but I'll pass it back to you in a moment. The elections in the United States and elsewhere internationally, there were a lot of elections in this past year. In fact, 64 different countries went to the electoral box last year. They've all been shaped by the rise of populist politics. And populism and the so-called culture wars that we really see underway right now in the United States in very stark relief are both a reaction to and a product of a world in rapid flux. And in Europe, as well as the United States, they're also rooted in the past, in the post-industrial economic disruptions of the 1980s. And that was actually the theme of the book that William mentioned, the 2021 book, There's Nothing for You Here. In the book, I drew upon my personal experience growing up in northeast England at a time when the coal mines and local industry that underpinned the region's economy and society all disappeared. I mean, they didn't quite disappear, but of course they were closed down during mass privatisation, restructuring. And I reflected on the developments that I'd experienced at first hand in the northeast with those that I saw unfold in Europe, in the United States and Europe, and also in Russia, the area of my research in a similar time frame, over the course of both my university studies beginning in the 1980s and later my research work at Brookings, which began about 25 years ago at Brookings. So in brief, for the last 50 years, parts of the United Kingdom, Europe, and the United States have been on divergent paths of development. Indeed, if we look at it, about a third of the populations in both Europe and the United States, often heavily concentrated in specific regions like northeast England, have fallen behind the mainstream in terms of incomes, life outcomes, educational attainment, and also life expectancy. And the new dividing line and marker of inequality in society in the United States in particular is actually education now. It's not really class, but education has started to stand in for those class markers that we'd be more familiar with in the past in the United Kingdom. So whether you have a 2 or a 4-year college degree, or no higher education at all or access to training is really the dividing line in the United States. And about 60% of the population might fall into that category one way or another. And this has had very serious ramifications for the health of our democracies, especially in the United States. So in a way, we're reaping today, with the populism and the rise of reactionary politics, the seeds of what we'd sowed half a century ago. Because populations who have felt left behind economically also feel left out politically. They're simultaneously excluded from economic opportunities and also from full civic participation. And as we've seen in all the recent elections, people who feel that the system's skewed against them are willing to protest. And they're quite prepared to shake things up and to shake up politics by supporting anti-establishment movements and authoritarian politicians, be it in the US, here in the UK, in Germany, Italy, France, and in many other countries. In fact, it's a fact at this moment that almost every country has some kind of socio-political and cultural fissure based on geography and economic inequality. So every country has, like in the UK, an instant a north-south divide, or in the United States, an east-west or centre-periphery divide, or an interior and coastal split in other countries. And these have exacerbated over time polarisation and political party or partisan divides over how countries should be governed and for who. And these partisan divides have also promoted anti-establishment and populist isolation politics, the kind of politics we're now seeing coming to the fore in the United States, where the demand for major domestic change also greatly complicates foreign policy and international cooperation. In that context, demographics plays a major role. And this is really why I want to get into the heart of some of the themes that Haberdashers is most renowned for. Because the north-south rift within countries is often emblematic of a generational rift between younger and older people, or sometimes just between young people and plain old people like myself. Western societies and many of the left-behind places within them are aging and increasingly childless. And you can see that in Northern England, you can see that in France, in the countryside, for example, in Ireland, and also in parts of the United States. And Western societies in many of these left-behind places are not only aging, but they're increasingly childless. They have low fertility and birth rates, and the future looks very different in these places from the rest of the world, the so-called global south, where you still have a population and youth boom. And here, elsewhere in the world, demographic, climate, and economic pressures come together to shape a very different and differently harsh perspective. And I think if we look at global affairs at the moment, we see that youth globally feels very much pitted against the old, which is often epitomized for them by the North, by Western societies. And their anger about the lack of opportunities and a future denied or withheld is roiling international politics, not just domestic politics. And look, I think this is one thing that we see very clearly in the fierce debates about immigration. I mean, that's the number one issue that's playing out in the United States at the moment. And if we consider the dynamics of global migration and immigration for a moment, why do migrants come to the United Kingdom, Europe, and the United States? They come for a future. And the declining Western populations see their best times in the past. So we have almost a kind of a clash between the future and the past, a kind of rift in that regard, not just between different demographic cohorts. So for declining Western populations, the best times might be in the past, and they're fret not just about lost identity, but about how they will share what they see as depleted resources and compete with newcomers, especially in these hollowed out former industrial areas with few educational and job prospects, limited affordable housing, and diminished prosperity. So in a world with these north-south rifts inside countries, not just between the global north and the south, all the key questions that we have to address are who has privileges like access to education, jobs and housing, which increasingly for young people is seen as a privilege. Who decides what changes in our societies? Who pays for those changes? Who benefits from those changes? Who does not? And who can guarantee and offer everyone a future, not just keep harking back to the past? These were themes that came out in every election over the past year. So all countries have to find ways to adapt their political and economic structures to address these demographic, social, economic, and technical changes they're contending with, and build more responsible governments and responsive governments and resilient societies. So, moving on to the next part of the theme here. As I work in a think tank at the Brookings Institution and currently serve as the Chancellor of a regional university in the UK, I personally think that this puts the spotlight on international, educational, and research sectors. Because how do you put people, social and economic issues, and our broader environment first? And how do you bring young people who are increasingly disaffected around the world into the political process? And that's really through education. Because education, in the sense of a kind of a broader ecosystem of institutions of learning and training, beginning in early childhood, is a fundamental source of resilience. It offers individuals the chance to develop knowledge, to learn skills, forge connections, and networks that can transform themselves, their communities, and their countries. And it provides resources to cope with change because it gives people tools to adapt to new demands and overcome difficulties. All of those words are linked, one way or another to the idea of resilience. And education is our collective investment, society's collective investment in the future. It's our way of passing on lessons from mistakes we made in the past, as well as new ways of thinking and all the fruits of our innovation. And if everyone has access to education, all of its forms, including training and skills, it's a great social and economic equalizer. Now, this realization obviously lies at the heart of the Haberdashers Company's investment in education over the centuries, and we see all the enlightened benefactors lining the walls here. And as well as the fact that haberdashers and other livery companies were fundamentally commercial entities, the benefactors of the past knew that educational institutions play a key role in economic development as well as in knowledge creation and reproduction. Now, unfortunately, this seems to be a point that we've often forgotten. And in the United States, the role of education in society seems to have been completely pushed to one side. Until, of course, in the last several weeks, in articles and podcasts and all kinds of discussion in the United States, people seem to have brought that back into their line of sight again. And this has all been a result of the upheaval in the United States, because the US government now has been suspending contracts and grants to major US research universities like Harvard, where I also happen to be on the board of overseers. It's attacked their charitable status, and it's disbanded or otherwise assaulted many of the institutions and foundations that have traditionally underpinned the post-World War II knowledge economy in the United States. And so that has also clarified the mind for many of people about thinking about the role of education in society in the United States. Personally, I've been thinking about the role of education in fostering societal resilience for quite some time, including, obviously in the course of writing the book that I wrote back in 2021. And in 2023, I spent almost 6 months at the Robert Bosch Academy in Berlin, specifically looking at how Germany dealt with the relationship between industrial decline that I talked about in the book, regional development, and political polarization. Because obviously Germany's been contending with quite a lot of political polarization, and also the rise of populist politics, especially in the former east of Germany. And I wanted to look at the best practices that Germany has put into place, including the role of education and universities in German policymaking at various junctures. And just a few points on things I took away from this. Germany, like the haberdashers and other livery companies, has been heavily invested in education for decades. They see education as instrumental in reducing regional inequality and fostering social cohesion, which we could also consider a component of resilience, the kind of idea of a shared purpose. In fact, the idea of social cohesion is in the German constitution since World War II. And in Germany, public education is explicitly seen as a driver of economic growth. So you have technical and vocational schools at different levels, not just universities, that all function as a pipeline for industry at the national and regional level. And most German universities and schools have a heavy curriculum focus on applied sciences and engineering, and also in providing opportunities for students to have study and work placements at the same time, including through all kinds of international partnerships. I'm not sure if haberdashers have any international partnerships, but German school networks are extraordinarily adept at developing these. And if you look at the regions of Germany in particular, it's very interesting because the industrial Ruhr region, which declined really quite dramatically as coal and steel was phased out in the 1960s and 1970s, what happened in the Ruhr region was investment in education increased as the investment in coal and steel decreased. So they saw a direct correlation between education and future development of the region. And the German government has compiled very helpfully all these national and regional level data showing the correlation directly between economic growth and education, including the creation of new alliances and partnerships, as I mentioned, and also new kinds of training schools in different regions. And you can actually, very easily look up that kind of information because all of these entities are public institutions. You can also see in places like the northeast of England, for example, where the region's 5 leading universities, including Durham, of course, but Newcastle, Northumbria, and Sunderland and Teesside, have also acknowledged that they themselves are important economic drivers within the region. I mean, collectively, the 5 universities in the northeast, 34,000 local jobs are affiliated with them, £2.2 billion per annum in terms of contributions to the northeast economy. And if we think of the UK writ large, the country's universities create more than, or support more than 768,000 jobs and produce or contribute about 130 billion to the country's economy. So, I mean, we can see here that education is an economic sector, not just, as I said, an important sector of knowledge creation. And I think it's this conscious emulation of these kind of practices of networks and of working together, as we saw in Germany and also in places like Greater Manchester, where there's also a successful model of university and educational collaboration that you can really see as a way of driving things forward. Now, unfortunately, in the United States, that kind of data isn't available. I mean, there are more than 6,000 different kinds of training colleges and universities in the United States with 16 different associations, and not all, of course, are public. Most of them tend to be private. And so it's actually very difficult for United States universities at the moment to collect data to show that they actually have a great value to society. They've had a lot of difficulty in dealing with this current moment, but they're going to have to adapt. They're going to have to be more resilient. Because in the United States right now, it's not just that there's a full-blown crisis in the educational sector, but the educational sector is essentially at war with the United States government. And if we look at what's been happening, education and research, including life-saving medical research, have actually gone from something being seen as a public good and essential elements in developing and growing regional and national economies to another politically contested area in the culture wars. So the value of higher education, as well as scientific discovery and expertise to students, society, and the economy, is being questioned by the president, the US administration, members of Congress, and segments of the general public. I mean, for someone like myself, who is very much a product of, enlightened education at all different levels, this is actually a tragedy. That we've seen the Department of Education itself being disbanded, books banned, libraries closed, scholarships ended, specific subjects actually targeted for elimination, and everything, including critical medical trials that are conducted in universities, being suspended at this moment. And of course, just like here in the United Kingdom or in Germany, universities and college clusters in the United States have been driving US prosperity ever since World War II. And in fact, even further back to the Civil War, where most of the universities were developed in the wake of the US Civil War. And since the 1980s, universities have spurred the redevelopment and transformation and turnaround of many left behind regions, including Massachusetts in the United States, which is now one of the greatest hubs of academic excellence. So just now to wrap up and conclude, I've mentioned economic development, and obviously the role that education plays in social mobility, I think, is clear to everyone here. But education also plays a very important role in the expansion, consolidation, and maintenance of democracy. And going back to Germany again, government studies indicate that German regions with the most robust educational networks have less political polarization than regions without. And you could actually see that in the recent elections, where the AfD really took a hold in areas that had less educational opportunity than in others, for example. And of course, here in the United Kingdom, a century ago, expanding education was seen as one of the antidotes to demagogy after the devastation of the First World War, led to the rise of authoritarian propagandist states like the Soviet Union after Russia's Bolshevik Revolution, alongside later in the 1920s and 1930s, fascist states like Germany, Italy, and Spain. And if you look at the United Kingdom, for example, in 1918, the UK's Education Act expanded the availability of public education, raised the school leaving age from 12 to 14, and introduced scholarships to grammar schools. I'm sure Haberdash has expanded in that period as well. Of course, you've got much older history and heritage of education here. But this 1918 UK Education Act also initiated plans for further educational innovation that we've seen over the course of the 20th century. And what's also interesting in the UK was in 1919, the British government went even further in advocating the permanent national necessity of establishing a system of adult education, which is actually unique in many of the European countries, and certainly differentiates the United Kingdom from the United States as well. And that was the whole idea, that you needed permanent education to keep up with all of the societal industrial challenges that came in that post-World War I and later, obviously, in the post-World War II period. And I'd just like to reflect on the thinking behind those reports of 1918 and 1919 just for a second, because I think it clarifies for us now where we are 100 years later. The whole idea was, and this was written down in these reports, a very enlightened idea, that British people should be able to think for themselves. They should be able to make informed judgments. And the country's education system should facilitate that. It should facilitate individual agency and critical thinking in troubled times. This is also the period when the BBC was established, and that was also based on the idea of equal access to information. Quite a contrast to where I started talking about the weaponization of information. The BBC's idea was this would be a tool for people to gain useful knowledge for themselves. So 100 years ago, the importance of having an educated, well-informed, self-motivated and resilient population was the heart of thinking here in the UK about how to respond to war and upheaval. Education was a means of preparing the next generations to deal with a world dominated by autocrats. So in the spirit of learning from the past, even a quite recent past, not just the past of it was in the 17th century, which was probably a part of the thinking back then as well, and given current geopolitical developments, I think on the hopeful phase, to bring this out a slightly happier ending, this is the idea that we have to embrace again, and we have these wonderful students here to help us, because education and knowledge are central to resilience. And I think there's no better place to enshrine this concept than here at the Haberdashers' Company with this education lecture. So thank you so much for your time, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion with our students. Thank you.
As an aspiring PPE student, something I'd like to do in the future, I wanted to take more of a political view on education. So my question would be, how should governments prioritize spending between areas such as education, healthcare, and defense in terms of crisis?
Well, it's very interesting that Sash decided to ask this question, because one of the things I've been involved in over the last 9 months is the UK Strategic Defence Review, and in fact we have the father-in-law of somebody who's working on that with us sitting in the front row here as well, but we won't out him in case, and this is actually been really looking across the whole UK about how you should think differently about defence. Because as we think about the complexities of the world that we're facing at the moment, defence isn't just about weapons and weapons systems. It's really about how we think about the world. And critical thinking is part of that, and so is education and skills. Because in the world that I've described at the very beginning, the greatest risk for us is basically assaults upon our own thinking, our way of thinking, our way of life, and also our critical national infrastructure. We've just seen this really devastating power blackout in Spain. I mean, we don't know at this particular point how that came about. And of course, there was a transformer that went out recently at Heathrow Airport. And we can just see how fragile everything is in terms of hanging on a thread. And so I think, thinking about our defence, we have to think about it in so many different ways. And part of that is also through the education system. We talked a lot in the review about is the country really prepared in terms of the skills, the kind of the mindset that young people have for dealing with a very complex digital world? Do we have a kind of a grasp of the larger geopolitics, the history of all of the crises that are facing us? And really, ultimately, dealing with all this is going to be done on a technical plane. So I think that actually education has to be thought of in the same context of resilience and preparing ourselves for the defence not just of our homeland, but the sort of defence of the way of life that we think is the most important to us and of our values and our democracy. And so I think that in the essence of what you want to study in terms of PPE moving forward, it's going to be really reformulating how we think about these issues. Healthcare is important to this as well. A resilient society is a healthy society. It's a well-educated society. It's a society that where people can think for themselves. And also, there was a theme from all of you here getting here tonight, which is quite difficult for some of you. Train delays, transportation. It's not just social mobility; it's physical mobility. It's very hard to be resilient when you're trapped on a train or in a lift, or you can't get from A to B. We're going to have to really think the whole way that we formulate ourselves and we structure our societies. And I think some lessons here that we can really get from some of our colleagues in Scandinavia. So I'll take the Finns just as a very brief example. A country like Finland, which of course is a quite small country of about 5 million people, they've thought about this issue of resilience and education and defence as all being linked together right from the very beginning. And it's tied up with having the best kind of educational sector where it's public, private, but mostly kind of a public-private partnership. Education is an investment in the future. It's an investment in the country and in resilience. They've thought about their transportation. They've thought about all of the defence, and they've thought about preparedness, all in the same context. And so, as I said here, I think it's the way that we think about things, and the fact that you actually have put this question, I'm feeling very hopeful that as you move forward in the next few years, Sash, that you will be able to take this forward.
You spoke about the conflicts and the struggles that occur in the world around us. How would you advise us to look past those and feel positive about the future, not just for all of us sitting here, but all of the young people?
Yes, I did think about this, that, as I said, it's a bit of a grim background that I started off describing. And the most important thing for all of us to have is some hope, that, things can, come out well in the end. But, hope, as we all know, is not sufficient in itself. I think what you have to do, and it's really kind of picking up in some regards about where I left things with Sash, is, we're best able to deal with the future when we're prepared, when we have full knowledge of all of the things that we have to deal with. I think that's also another part of this theme and this idea of resilience. A couple of years ago, I was actually asked to give one of the lectures for the BBC, the Reith Lectures, along with 3 other individuals, and it was the 4 freedoms of Roosevelt, that from his famous speech during World War II. And I was given freedom from fear. And I thought, oh gosh, that's how do you start to think about this? And actually, what I realized as I thought about it and talked to people more, I talked to one amazing woman who was an astronaut. And I said to her, she was one of the astronauts, a teacher in the United States who had to go into space after the Challenger disaster, where her closest friend, Kirsty McAuliffe, had been killed when the Challenger rocket had exploded. And I said, my goodness, how did you possibly prepare yourself for going into space after such a terrible accident? And she said, courage is contagious, not just fear. And when you're working in a team with other people and you're trying to resolve all of the issues and to really prepare yourself and to train, you find that you get courage. And I think that that's actually that's certainly a lesson that I took away from this. Fear is actually about the unknown, not really kind of knowing what to expect. And again, we have so much uncertainty. But if you have the courage to address these challenges, to think about them, to study them, to get as much information as possible, then you have really a kind of an opportunity to tackle them. It's also a way of thinking about insurance. I realize that insurance is, kind of part of reassurance and a part of being prepared. When you have an insurance policy, you're basically, not just taking out the financial wherewithal to help you in the times of a disaster, but you're also thinking, through that insurance policy. Do I need to insure myself against perhaps a flood? I'm here in London, yes, and that's why you have the Thames barrier, but perhaps not in, in the middle of a desert, although actually these days with climate change, there might be some unexpected flood that happened quite recently in Death Valley, so, you have to, gauge all of the possibilities of that, but you have to be pretty well informed to think about the type of insurance that you need to avail yourself of. So I think it really comes down to preparation, to knowledge, to addressing the challenges head on, and to working with others in that company to basically acquire the courage, the contagious courage, to be able to address them.
You've obviously worked very interestingly with some quite interesting figures in American politics, even Donald Trump, who all have their different political approaches to leadership. So my question is, how have their different political approaches impacted your views on national leadership?
It's funny, there's a kind of a theme that I see that's kind of coming along here, because Donald Trump and preparedness don't really go together. And a deep study of a particular issue. And actually, I think that is one of the key differences. So George W. Bush, he, I think, got kind of a little bit of unfair criticism. He did have some errors of judgment. The Iraq War leaps to mind. But he actually was somebody who was deeply interested and intellectually curious. Perhaps he could have gone further on Iraq and kind of thinking about this in advance. But in the role that I played back in that time, I was the National Intelligence Officer for Europe and Russia. And George W. Bush actually wanted to immerse himself in as much information as possible ahead of meeting with Vladimir Putin, for example. And we would do things called deep dives, where he'd actually spend a full hour wanting to ask all kinds of questions. He didn't like to read the briefs, and you might actually know that he had dyslexia. So he was somebody who then, got most of his education through, more oral interactions. And he'd gone to Yale, of course, to university, and he'd managed to compensate for his initial learning difficulties by finding, different ways of approaching the same material. So he liked to do these deep dives. I was quite astounded that he'd put aside a whole hour, to basically ask a lot of questions and have a back and forth. And, that actually really helped to inform. And I also thought that was a very interesting exercise in leadership, because he was willing to be challenged and also, kind of willing to put a lot of questions to admit that he didn't really, know all of the details. Barack Obama was extraordinarily difficult. I mean, he was a lawyer, a legal scholar, extraordinarily well-read, well-informed. He would read everything. And he would sort of sit and listen as you tried to kind of brief him, and he wouldn't give you very much time to brief. He would have the Rodin's the thinker look, and kind of look at you like this, which was disconcerting because you didn't know what he was thinking. And then he would ask one or two questions, and that would be it. But he would extraordinarily well informed and taken his brief. And then with Trump, obviously didn't want to know anything that we had said at all. So although we'd prepare, he just wouldn't be particularly interested. And I think you see a difference there. Obama had a lot of criticism for deliberating too much in many respects. He'd spend a lot of time, judiciously weighing everything up. Trump was obviously very impetuous, and you'd never be quite sure what he's going to decide from one moment to the next. And Bush was somewhere, in the middle, but perhaps not always. Many of us, I think, would agree with some of the best judgments on international affairs in terms of, as I said, on Iraq. But certainly somebody who was trying, very hard to grasp the issues. And I think that's it's an important part of leadership to be well informed and to be well prepared. And you see the difference when people are not.
Earlier you spoke about how there were shortages in Spain, and you also spoke just now about being well prepared. So a government report between 2023 and 2024 showed that there was a 20% increase in the amount of teacher vacancies. And so that means more teachers are starting to have to take increased workload, and students get less times with teachers. So my question is, for the current teachers and the current students, how can they maximize their time efficiently to get the best out of education?
Well, the ideal would be, of course, that there are more teachers and more investment in teachers, because I think that human contact and that contact with people in small groups and get something that Sash was also laying out there is extremely important. And look, I think for all of you here, and I'm sure many in the audience, probably one of the most critical people in your life was an inspirational teacher or several inspirational teachers. I wouldn't be here if it hadn't been for teachers that I was able to forge a relationship with. And it's very hard to do that if your class size is 30 and above or in the 20s. I think we all benefit from kind of smaller groups and interactions. However, there are some ways in which we can then use different sources of information, different approaches to teaching. Harvard, where I'm on the board of overseas at the moment, and MIT, for example, have put together an educational platform called Axim, which many of you might be able to check out. It's mostly geared towards colleges and universities in the United States. It's come out of an earlier program called WebEx, which some of you might be familiar with, which is a kind of a platform for putting instructional materials online. And they sold WebEx off to a private company, and then they invested all the profits of this back into this other platform. And they're really wanting to make this accessible to universities and colleges across the United States where they might not be able to offer teaching in certain subjects, or there might be a shortage of staff for key issues, so that the teachers who are there are able to kind of engage with this material online, and they may also be able to engage with Harvard faculty. And I think if we look around the country, obviously haberdashers, you have this amazing network of schools, you have a large number of students, there are all kinds of academies and other networks of of schools rather around the country. The question is how to link up some of these networks, so that maybe if there are teachers, in other schools who might be, able to not just put their material online, but perhaps to interact with students at another school who might have, some specific skill set, to maybe partner students up with students at other schools, because you can have a lot of peer-to-peer instruction as well. My daughter actually is part of a network that she benefits from, rather than the other way around, I have to say, with peer tutoring. she actually has incredibly, she wouldn't like me telling you about this, but anyway, she has acute exam anxiety, which is a thing. There's a book about it called Choke, and we didn't recognize it at first. We thought she was, perhaps just getting a little carried away, with her exam anxiety, but it turns out that it's, a real problem. She's actually been able to overcome it by peer-to-peer tutoring on subjects where maybe a somewhat older student who's experienced some of this themselves online, will spend an hour a week with her talking through her subjects and just reinforcing that she actually knows the subject. And, so there's all kinds of creative ways of thinking about this. But of course, that also puts a lot of pressure on head teachers. And so I think that this is also a way of thinking about how networks can lean into this. And it could be also another area in which thinking about PPE and thinking about, the role of governments, that the educational departments and others, and perhaps universities with educational institutions and schools of education can also assist. But I think it's a very important issue. But again, I think it's much more important for us to emphasize the value of teaching, because that human contact, the contact is not going to be with AI and a chatbot, it's going to be pretty critical.